Life often throws unexpected surprises our way, especially when we least anticipate them. This was exactly my experience on what seemed like an ordinary Wednesday night. I had just returned home from a long, exhausting day at work. My heels echoed on the wooden floor as I entered the house, yearning to unwind with a soothing bath and let all the stress melt away. Little did I know, that evening would leave a lasting impact on my life and alter everything in our household. If you enjoy true stories like this, make sure to subscribe to my channel and watch this video till the end. Don't forget to like it to show your support. The house was unusually silent as I stepped in, which wasn't out of the ordinary. Michael, my husband, had mentioned earlier that he had a late meeting. He'd been putting in long hours recently to meet a crucial project deadline, leaving only our 20-year-old son Ethan from his previous marriage at home. Ethan was a reserved yet courteous young man who rarely caused any issues. He worked part-time at the local hardware store and spent most of his free time in his room. Although we weren't particularly close, our relationship was respectful and cordial. I always saw him as someone who cherished his privacy, much like his father. Over the years, I had grown accustomed to the quietness in the house when it was just Michael and me. As I placed my bag on the kitchen counter and poured myself a glass of water, I noticed Ethan's truck parked in the driveway. That was odd since he usually worked the evening shift. I called out his name casually, my voice echoing through the empty house, but there was no response. Assuming he was in his room with headphones on or simply taking a nap, I didn't think much of it. After finishing my water, I decided to head upstairs to change into something more comfortable. The long day had left me eager to relax. Passing by the bathroom, I heard the faint sound of running water and saw the door slightly ajar. This was unusual because Ethan was always meticulous about his privacy, especially regarding the bathroom door. My curiosity got the better of me, and I hesitated for a moment before gently pushing the door open a bit more. What I saw inside stopped me in my tracks. Ethan stood by the sink, his back to me, shoulders hunched as if he was deeply focused on something. His movements were awkward, almost frantic, and he was shirtless with his jeans hanging loosely on his hips. In his hands he held a washcloth, scrubbing something out of sight. The creak of the door startled him, and he spun around with wide, panicked eyes. "Oh my gosh, I didn't hear you come in," he exclaimed, his voice shaky. I froze, equally surprised. My eyes darted between him and the washcloth, and an awkward wave of guilt washed over me for intruding. "I'm so sorry," I stammered. "I didn't mean to invade your privacy." Quickly I stepped back, my heart racing. I reached for the doorknob, ready to leave and give him the space he clearly wanted. But before I could close the door, Ethan's voice stopped me. "Wait," he pleaded. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob. Part of me wanted to bolt down the hallway and pretend this never happened, but another part was curious. His voice lacked the defensiveness of someone caught doing something wrong. Instead, it was filled with embarrassment and desperation. Against my better judgment, I turned back to face him, keeping my gaze on his face. "Okay," I said seriously, trying to maintain a neutral tone. "What's going on?" Ethan looked down, his face flushed a deep red. He seemed to struggle to find the right words, his hands fidgeting with the washcloth. Finally, he sighed deeply and said, "It's just, I didn't know who else to ask." "Ask about what?" I pressed gently, my curiosity growing despite the awkwardness. "It's personal," he admitted. "I've been dealing with some stuff and I don't know what to do. Dad's not here, and you're the only other person I can talk to." His vulnerability took me by surprise. Ethan had always been independent, rarely opening up about anything personal. The fact that he was turning to me for help made me pause. I took a step into the bathroom, closing the door slightly behind me to give us some privacy. "All right," I said, keeping my tone calm. "Why don't you tell me what's going on?" Ethan hesitated but eventually began to explain. He spoke in vague terms at first, stumbling over his words as he tried to describe the discomfort he'd been experiencing. I listened patiently, piecing together his thoughts. It became clear that he was dealing with a sensitive issue he felt too embarrassed to discuss with Michael. "First of all, it's good that you're paying attention to these things. It shows you care about your health. And there's no shame in asking questions or seeking advice," I encouraged him. Ethan looked up at me, his eyes filled with gratitude and relief. Really? You don't think it's weird? Not at all, I assured him. Everyone has questions about their body at some point. It's completely normal. We spent the next several minutes discussing his concerns. I offered him advice based on my own knowledge and experience, keeping the conversation practical and straightforward to avoid making him feel more uncomfortable. I could tell that this conversation was a huge relief for him, even if it had started awkwardly. As we continued talking, the initial tension began to fade. Ethan seemed to relax, visibly calmer by the end of our discussion. He managed a small smile and said, "Thanks. I didn't think I could talk to anyone about this." I returned his smile, feeling relieved that the tension had passed. "You're welcome, Ethan. Remember, it's always okay to ask for help. No one has all the answers." 3:56. As I left the bathroom, a mix of emotions swirled within me. I was glad I could be there for Ethan when he needed someone to talk to, but the situation had been so unexpected that I wasn't sure how to process it. It felt like a significant shift in our relationship, though I didn't know exactly what it meant or how it would affect us moving forward. I tried to shake off the strange feeling as I went about the rest of my evening, but it lingered like a shadow in the back of my mind. The house remained quiet, with only the faint hum of the air conditioning. Michael returned home late that night, tired but cheerful, completely unaware of the unusual conversation that had taken place in his absence. 7:55. Lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop replaying the events of the evening. Something had changed, though I couldn't quite pinpoint what. All I knew was that life in our household would never feel the same again. In the days that followed, things felt peculiar. Nothing overtly dramatic happened. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Michael continued his work as usual, Ethan maintained his routine of part-time shifts and studying, and I balanced my responsibilities at home and work. However, beneath the surface, an unspoken tension lingered between Ethan and me. It wasn't just that we were now more aware of each other's vulnerabilities. It was something deeper. A shift in our dynamic had occurred, one that I wasn't sure how to navigate. Ethan had always been an enigma to me, keeping most of his life to himself. Our conversations, though polite, had never gone beyond surface-level pleasantries. But after our bathroom conversation, I felt a new level of understanding between us, something both uncomfortable and strangely comforting. I found myself thinking about him more, not in a motherly or concerned way, but with a sense of wonder. How had I not seen this side of him before? I realized that Ethan was more than just the quiet young man who kept to his room. There was depth to him, an emotional world I hadn't begun to understand. 9:03. It was a Friday evening when the change in Ethan's behavior became more noticeable. Michael had gone out to meet a client, and I was preparing dinner. Ethan hadn't yet returned from his shift at the hardware store. As I chopped vegetables, I heard the familiar sound of his truck pulling into the driveway. I paused, my knife hovering midair, unsure of how to greet him given the recent awkwardness between us. When the front door opened, I called out, "Hey Ethan," trying to sound casual. He didn't respond immediately, but I heard his footsteps as he walked into the kitchen. He looked tired but offered a faint smile. "Hey," he said quietly. "What's for dinner?" I smiled, relieved that he wasn't acting distant as he had in the past few days. "Just some pasta. You hungry?" "Yeah, I'm starving," he replied, walking over to get a glass of water. We ate together in silence at first, the only sound being the clink of forks against plates. However, I noticed that Ethan seemed more at ease than he had been lately. His smile was a bit more genuine, and his body language was less stiff. After a while, he set his fork down and looked at me, a faint blush coloring his cheeks. "I've been thinking about what you said the other night," he began, hesitating before continuing. "I just wanted to thank you again for listening." I glanced up from my plate, meeting his eyes. The sincerity in his voice softened my heart. I had been waiting for this moment, unsure of how to respond but glad he felt comfortable enough to speak. "Of course, Ethan," I said gently. "I'm glad I could help." There was another long pause, but this time the awkwardness had lifted. It felt like we were truly communicating, not just engaging in polite conversation. "You've always been nice to me," he continued softly. "I didn't want you to think I didn't appreciate it." I nodded, unsure of how to express how much his words meant to me. I know it's not always easy, I replied after a moment, but I'm glad you know you can talk to me anytime. He smiled again, this time with a bit more ease. I'll try to remember that, he said, reaching for another bite of his pasta. As dinner progressed, we slipped into more casual conversation, discussing his studies, his part-time job, and the latest show we were both watching on Netflix. It was a small step forward, but a step nonetheless. I realized that, despite the initial awkwardness, Ethan was beginning to open up in small ways. Later that evening, after we finished eating, I settled on the couch with a book. I heard Ethan retreat to his room, his footsteps soft against the floor. I couldn't help but wonder if he was still processing everything we had discussed. 12:33. The next few days were much the same. Michael came home later each night, his work demanding more of his time, and Ethan, though less distant than before, still kept to himself. We shared brief but meaningful conversations during dinner, and he seemed more comfortable around me. However, an underlying tension remained that neither of us seemed ready to address. About a week after our initial bathroom conversation, Ethan did something that completely took me by surprise. It was nearing bedtime, and I was curled up on the couch watching the latest episode of a drama when Ethan appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Can I talk to you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I sat up quickly, unsure of what to expect. "Of course, come on in," I replied, trying to sound welcoming. He hesitated for a moment before fully stepping into the room, his posture stiff as if unsure of how to begin. "What's on your mind?" I asked gently, aiming to create a safe space for him. Ethan shifted from foot to foot, avoiding my gaze for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking about the stuff I talked to you about, and I think I need to tell Dad. I don't know how, but I think he needs to know what I'm going through." I was stunned by his words. The vulnerability he showed was different from before, a significant step forward. He was taking responsibility for his feelings and acknowledging that he needed help from Michael, not just from me. "That's a big step, Ethan. I think Michael will appreciate you coming to him," I reassured him. "It's not easy, but it's important." He nodded, his eyes meeting mine with a flicker of gratitude. "I don't want to make things weird between us," he said quietly. "I know it's been different lately," I replied, shaking my head with a warm feeling towards him. "It's not weird at all. We're family, Ethan. We help each other no matter what." He gave me a small smile and nodded before turning to leave. "Thanks for everything," he said over his shoulder as he exited the room. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, feeling a deep sense of pride in him. He was learning to communicate, seek help, and process his emotions in a healthy way. It felt like I was witnessing a pivotal moment in his growth. 15:32. The next day, Michael came home from work earlier than usual. I could see the exhaustion on his face, but there was a lightness to his steps as he walked in the door. "Hey," he greeted, dropping his briefcase by the door. "How's everything going?" "Good," I replied with a smile. "I think Ethan has something on his mind, though." Michael raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "He's been more open lately." I explained the situation, mentioning that Ethan wanted to talk to him about something important. Michael's expression softened, a mix of concern and anticipation crossing his face. "I'll talk to him," he said with quiet resolve. "Thanks for letting me know." That evening after dinner, Michael and Ethan sat down together in the living room. I couldn't hear much of their conversation, but I saw Ethan lean in, speaking earnestly to his father. Michael listened intently, his face showing both concern and warmth. It was clear this was a pivotal moment for their relationship, a step where Ethan was transitioning into adulthood and Michael was ready to support him. As the weeks passed, life began to settle back into a comfortable rhythm. The unspoken tension between Ethan and me gradually faded. He no longer avoided me, and I could sense he was still processing the things he had shared, but he seemed lighter somehow, more himself. Michael and Ethan spent more time together, strengthening their bond, and it was evident that Michael was making an effort to be more present for his son. One weekend, Michael suggested a day trip to the lake, a way to strengthen the bond between the three of us. I thought it was a wonderful idea. The weather was perfect with clear blue skies and a gentle breeze. We packed a picnic, loaded the car, and set off for a day of relaxation and fun at the lake. 17:16, we spent hours swimming, playing frisbee, and lounging on the shore. Ethan seemed genuinely happy, laughing and joking with Michael in a way I hadn't seen before. It warmed my heart to see them connecting, and I felt hopeful that this trip was a turning point for all of us. As the sun began to set, casting golden hues over the water, we sat on the beach enjoying the last moments of the day. Michael had fallen asleep on a blanket, his snores blending with the sound of the waves. Ethan and I sat a few feet apart, watching the horizon. "Thanks for coming today," he said after a long silence. "It's been nice, just spending time together." I smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over me. "I'm glad. We should do things like this more often." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the water. "Yeah, I think it helps." We sat in silence for a while longer, the unspoken understanding between us filling the quiet. When Michael woke up, we packed up our things and headed home. The drive filled with laughter and stories about the day. That night, as I lay in bed next to Michael, I reflected on how far we had come as a family. The past few weeks had been challenging, but they had also brought us closer together in ways I hadn't anticipated. Ethan's journey was far from over, but I felt confident he was on the right path, and so were we.